Okay, I'm going to begin. Welcome everybody. Thanks for using us as an excuse to evade the budget speech. Always happy to be of service in the fight against depression. So today we're with Nic Newman, who's the lead author of the Reuters Institute for Journalism Digital News Report for 2020. We have Mahlase, who is the editor-in-chief of Eyewitness News and also chairman of the South Africa National Editors Forum. And then we have Purity Mukami, who is from Africa Uncensored in Kenya, and also one of Code for Africa, which is the organization I work for, one of our Data network of women data scientists across Africa. My name is Chris Roper, and I'm the Deputy Director of Code for Africa, which is a Pan-African federation of media and tech labs, essentially. So the format for today is, Nic's going to take us through about a 25 minute kind of a summary of the high notes of the digital news report. And then we're going to have a 30 to 40 minute panel where we discuss both the general global results, but also the results that are particular to South Africa and to Kenya. So last year, Code for Africa helped with the South Africa part of the digital news report. And this year, Nic and Reuters have added Kenya in as part of the 40 countries that they've covered. I'm hoping that there'll be more African countries next year. So without any ado, let me hand over to Nic. But just before that, let me just remind you that you can ask questions by typing them out on the chat, and we'll try and cover as many of them as possible. So Nic, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Really good to see everybody on the call, and thanks for joining us. And I'm really keen to, I'm looking forward to the conversation where we talk about some of the sort of implications. And I'll be, just in this 20 minutes or so, I'll talk a little bit about obviously the impact of coronavirus on media in terms of consumption, but also potentially going forwards in terms of business models. We'll look at trust and misinformation, obviously critical for media overall. And I'll also be looking in a bit more detail at some of the data from both Kenya and South Africa, and look at how those countries are maybe different, but also where there are similarities with other countries in our survey. This is actually our 9th digital news report. And as Chris has already mentioned, we've added Kenya this year, we added South Africa last year, also added the Philippines, and it's part of a process where we're trying to make the survey more global over time. And just a reminder of the methodology. So it is based on an online poll. So it is representative of people who are online, and as such, it will tend to underrepresent traditional news behaviors, such as television, print, and radio, when we talk about cross-platform behavior. And that's particularly important to note in countries with lower internet penetration, such as Kenya and South Africa, and some of the others that are marked by the asterisks. And also important to note that in both Kenya and South Africa, it tends to be a slightly more urban sample, a younger sample. And in Kenya in particular, we're just looking at the age groups of 18 to 55, because within market research, it's really hard to get older groups reliably. Polling was done on our behalf by YouGov, and we have samples of around 2,000 in each market. It's also, I should just say, it's an independent study. Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism is part of Oxford University, so we get some core funding from Reuters, but we have many sponsors, and you can see them here, including media organizations, Google, academic institutions around the world as well. So a reminder, I should make clear that the main survey was conducted in January, February, so coronavirus was underway, but before the lockdowns in many countries. We did a second survey in April in 6 countries to understand the impact, which has obviously been considerable on the business side and also in terms of consumer behavior. So much of this is pretty well documented, but it's also important to note. So one of the things we saw initially was a really significant increase in the use of television news. So in the UK, for example, it was up 16 percentage points between our poll in January and April, which is kind of in line with previous research. When it comes to, really big news, when it comes to a crisis, people kind of really still turn to television. But it was interesting that actually across the 6 countries we polled in both January and April, we see that pretty much all media was up, all news was up. People were desperate for reliable information. So television was up, online was up, social media was hugely up as well. In many cases, people learning to be part of WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups for the first time, you know, Zoom calls, things like this. And the main casualty was print because of the problems of sort of physical distribution. Print was, in many countries, significantly down. Many newspapers have stopped physical distribution, which is one of the reasons why we think this is going to be an accelerator to more digital change. So one of the effects is likely to be much more move away from print, for example, towards more digital. Just in terms of industry data, this is some industry data that the BBC gave us. We reference it in the report, and it just shows how traffic to the BBC News website in the UK doubled within just a few days at the start of the lockdowns. So again, reinforcing that point that at times of crisis, people really come to brands that they know, that they trust, and we saw that continuing to peak and then sort of leveling off to some extent. So it's still higher than it was before the crisis, but not as high as but not as high as at the peak. And we've seen trusted newspaper websites very similar trends. So one of the things that, as I say, we think this is going to accelerate is the change of business models, sort of away from advertising supported media to some extent at least, because the weakness of advertising is going to push innovation in business models, either to paid models or to more hybrid models. And in our data, even before the crisis, so this is from January, remember, we've already seen in a number of countries significant increases in the percentage of people paying for news. So in the US, for example, it was up 4 percentage points in January, and it's grown even more since. We've seen for many years countries in the Nordic region really pushing paid models, but we're starting to see this elsewhere in the world now as well. So publishers in all parts of the world now are adopting some of these models, and it's starting to have some effect. We also find, we did a more detailed study in a few countries, we also found that some of the effects of moving towards more paid media are that you get a few big winners. So there's going to be a few in the UK, not many people are paying for news yet, but of those that do, around 50% go to 2 big titles, the Times of London and the Telegraph. In the US, it's the New York Times and Washington Post. Norway is a bit of an oddity. It's kind of national news brands, just a few of them, and then actually people pay for local news as well. So sort of winner takes most dynamics persisting, but we also see, interestingly, smaller brands or niche brands online also benefiting. So I think we're going to see a few big winners and then some other developments as well. And one of the most interesting changes that we've seen in the wake of coronavirus is the growth of more donation or membership models. So here's an example from the US Vox, starting, which was relying on advertising, now basically adding on a contribution model as well. So saying, you like our free, independent, explanatory journalism, so contribute some money to help navigate the coronavirus. So linking it directly to what's going on. In the UK, The Guardian, which has been a real sort of pioneer of the open model, again, focusing its messaging on trust. Trust has never mattered more than it does today. And again, encouraging people to contribute or subscribe while still having an open model. So in the UK, I think they were talking about, or across the world, they were talking about an extra 50,000 recurring supporters in April alone after coronavirus. And in other parts of the world, so in South Africa, you obviously have the Daily Maverick, again, pursuing a membership model, but in combination with a range of diversified revenue streams. So I think that the trend is going to be away from just relying on advertising to a much bigger range of business models. And if that happens, one of the key issues, I think, is going to be trust. Trust will become much more critical with reader models. We know that in some countries, when coronavirus hit, media trust went up because some of the traditional sort of partisanship disappeared, and it was much more about sort of everyone uniting around getting reliable information. But we also know in countries like the UK that trust has gone back down again very quickly as sort of the media became more critical of government and as traditional partisan politics re-emerged. And when we look at in general what's been happening with trust over the last year, so this is data from January across all 40 countries, we see a further fall in trust over the previous year. So just 38% say they now trust most news most of the time. So it's a bit more in the brands that you use yourself, so 46%, but again, across the board in general, it's down, and less still in some of the distributed environments like search or social, where information can be more unreliable. And if we look at our full set of countries or markets, we see there's quite a big range between countries in terms of how much people trust the news in their country. So it tends to be highest in some of those Scandinavian countries, Finland, for example, and pretty low, it's consistently been low in Korea, where people don't think the media is sufficiently robust or independent of business or government. But there's a whole load in the middle as well. And it's really interesting to see some of the, albeit sort of these are more elite audiences, maybe trust the media a bit more, but even so, the trust is by our standards relatively high still in Kenya and South Africa. And I'll show you the brand trust list in a minute, with quite low distrust figures, which is kind of encouraging. In the United States and the UK, we have very high levels of distrust, which is pushing the overall figures quite low. And one of the other things we've noticed over the years with trust is when you get sort of political upheaval, when you get really divisive issues, such as in Hong Kong extradition bill process, or in the UK in the last year, we've had more division over Brexit and a very, very polarizing election. This really affects trust figures. So it's essentially people who feel passionately about a particular issue, and they see the media as sort of not necessarily being neutral in that or taking sides, or they see hidden biases or real biases in the news. So this is, I think, a sort of a very key ongoing factor. So trust in the UK down 12 percentage points. So these are the brand trust figures in South Africa and Kenya. Actually, it looks
Hi, everybody. It seems like we've lost Nick. Can people still hear me? Yeah, everybody says they can hear me. We'll try and repair that in a moment. I see Nick's disappeared. Let me just check with our tech people. Oh, Nick, you're back. But you might be muted, Nick. Unmute.
I was in full flow, was I?
Yeah, so I'm afraid you'll have to backtrack to just.
What was I talking about? Trust.
Yeah, and you're just spoken about the brands in Kenya and South Africa.
Yeah, sorry about that. You suddenly disappeared from my screen as well, so I assumed something had gone wrong. That's the excitement of these Zoom calls, right? Okay, so yeah, so what I was saying was that in many countries we find that television news tends to be the most trusted, but in South Africa we have a digital-born brand, and you also tend to have sort of more tabloid brands like Daily Sun, who have higher distrust figures as well. But that kind of gives you an idea, and it's quite unusual to see quite low distrust figures in general in Kenya, which I suppose speaks to this this sort of difference over yeah, just the difference in the African market. We can talk about that maybe in the chat. So in terms of misinformation, it's interesting that we see position. So although trust scores are quite high, we also see people are really much more concerned in Kenya and South Africa in misinformation. So around 70% or more say that they find it hard to tell the difference between what's true and what's false when it comes to news on the internet. So that again is higher than in many other countries. And when we asked people this year, you know, who do they blame most? So in terms of content, people seem to be most concerned about politicians. So 40% in general, but actually higher than that in South Africa and in Kenya, followed by activists and then journalists and then ordinary people and foreign governments. When it comes to the channels of misinformation, so which channels do people most concerned about in terms of the spread of disinformation and disinformation? So on average across countries, people have the highest level of concern about Facebook, and then followed by messaging apps, and then search and YouTube and Twitter, though this does vary considerably by country, as we've reported before. So it tends to be that in many countries in the global south, such as Brazil, Malaysia, Chile, people are more concerned about WhatsApp than they are about Facebook. And actually in South Africa, it's pretty well split. So 30% say they're most concerned about Facebook, 23% about WhatsApp. Kenya is a reasonably similar split as well. And obviously that is a particular problem because it's often much harder to understand what's going on in these closed messaging applications. Now, a new question that we asked for this year, which is particularly relevant given that politicians are seen as spreading a lot of misinformation and other forms of online harm. So one of the big debates is, how should the media report these statements? So for example, should it carry Donald Trump's statements on coronavirus cures, even if it knows that they could damage people? Or also should social media block some statements by elected politicians? So this is data from January, and just looking at the media first, we have a sort of clear view from the public that people think that the media should basically report what politicians say, even if it might be unreliable, because they think that it's important that those views are heard. So broadly, the consensus is, report it, provide context, of course, but you shouldn't block or hide things. When it comes to social media, we see a different set of attitudes. And I should say clearly, this is about political advertisements. So should social media companies block political advertisements that could be inaccurate? And the public seems to be more concerned about this, perhaps because of the lack of context, perhaps because it's a much newer thing and there's less transparency around how those ads appear and who's providing those ads. So platforms might not want to be the arbiters of truth. They've said they don't want to do that. But there's a sense here that the public would like them to do more, would like them to intervene, at least when it comes to political advertisements that might be untrue. Just a little bit more about how media in Kenya and South Africa is different. This won't surprise you. So it is much more mobile. So similar levels in both Kenya and South Africa amongst our samples, who say that the smartphone, they use the smartphone weekly for news, and most people in our samples say that that is their main source of news, more than the computer and the tablet. And that compares with around sort of say 60% in the UK. So in general, there is more use of computers and tablets in European countries, for example, than in Africa. In terms of specific social media and messaging applications, well, both countries are right at the top end of the use of social media for news. So what you have here is the percentages in each country who use each network for any purpose. So you've got Facebook at the top in South Africa and WhatsApp at the top in Kenya. That's very rare in our survey. Mostly it is Facebook at the top. But again, in South Africa too, 88% say they use WhatsApp for any purpose. So more people say they use WhatsApp than Facebook for any purpose. And for news, it's slightly reversed, but still WhatsApp is incredibly important. So this is very, very different to how people use WhatsApp in the UK. So very small proportion, or the US, very small proportion of people are using WhatsApp for news, although increasing numbers are using it for any purpose. And then, Twitter's kind of important and relevant with influencers. Instagram, we see generally is becoming much more important and is important and growing in both countries. This is a chart which shows the historic position. This obviously doesn't include Kenya and South Africa because we've only recently started here, but going back to 2014 across a few countries, we see Facebook for any purpose pretty level. We see YouTube rising. We see that huge rise in WhatsApp, the green, from 17 to 48%. We see Instagram as one of the fastest growing networks with young people in particular, but actually more generally. And it's really been interesting to see in the coronavirus crisis, when talking about climate change, Instagram has become an incredibly important way of alerting people and telling stories about what's going on for the media, but also with influencers over the last year. And then in terms of gateways to news, this is a really interesting question that we ask about how people get to news. So what's your starting point digitally when you're starting a news journey? Do you tend to go directly to an app or to a news website? Do you tend to start in social media and come across news that way? Do you search for something, or is it a mobile alert or an email that has sparked your interest in the news? And in general, every year we see slightly fewer people who go directly to news websites and slightly more people who are coming in via these side doors via social media. And that obviously is a huge challenge for media companies. But this is the general picture. I think what's interesting is looking at splitting that down into different countries. You see very, very different models. So in some of those Northern European countries, you have this very strong brand allegiance. So most people go directly to a news website. Then you have a set of other countries, and I put Kenya in here, where the core preference of our sample certainly is you're kind of in social media, and that's where you start. And you saw that from the very strong figures on social media for news. So this is where people are starting. So that direct relationship with the brands is already more difficult. Now, this may just be because Kenya has a much younger population, and so it's reflecting those younger, newer digital practices. Whereas South Africa is a little bit more pick and mix. So when we ask about preferences, you've got some people who prefer to go directly, and many of those will be maybe older. And then social media, you've got maybe younger people who tend to come in via social media. And then finally, in some other countries of the world, we see a completely different model, which is people are basically accessing news brands through aggregators, so through huge search engines or aggregators like Yahoo. So we do see, really significant differences, and it's quite interesting to see where both South Africa and Kenya sit here, because it will have an effect on how closely you can build direct relationships. And given all that, I just wanted to finish by talking about a trend that we see in our data around editorial curation and ways in which maybe publishers can build more habit and more connection. And one of the mechanisms in which people are increasingly doing this is email. Now, email is not a new thing, right? But it's been developed over the last few years in quite interesting ways. So in many parts of the world, like the United States, you have publishers doing maybe 40, 50, 60 emails that are really more focused on specific groups and building those direct relationships. Of those people who are getting emails, the vast majority are now getting emails that have this sort of daily update. So it's essentially timed and scheduled to fit in with your day and to start your day, or maybe at lunchtime, or maybe just after lunch. A great example is the New York Times one. So they have 17 million subscribers. They now say this is one of the biggest audiences for their journalism in total. So compared with the newspaper or the front page of the website, this is critical. They've appointed a human curator, they call him an anchor, David Leonhardt, to manage that relationship and bring personality to digital, which is one of the things that I think has been really missing. And then we see the same thing with podcasts. Podcasts have been really taking off in parts of Europe and North America in the last few years, so increasing numbers for news. So news wasn't really a thing with podcasts, but in the last few years we've really seen a big growth in daily news podcasts, which really engage people and really engage younger people. So younger people are much more likely to consume news podcasts, and they often consume them in depth. So in our survey, 50% said podcasts give them a deeper understanding of issues than other forms of media. They're typically listening for 20, 25 minutes. And whereas digital tends to be much more of a transitory, in and out approach, maybe mediated by social media. So I think these will be a critical part of how media moves forward and tries to build more of those direct connections in this world where social media is so powerful. So just to sort of summarize some of the sort of key points, so coronavirus has increased the demand for news, obviously, but it's also really made the economics much more uncertain. And we're seeing change, I think a big change from the advertising model to mixed models or hybrid models or subscription models or membership models. I think that will take some time to play out. Trust in the news continues to fall. Partisanship is a key factor here, and big questions about how we rebuild trust. The level of misinformation, countering misinformation, that's obviously going to be a key part of it. We find that people really blame politicians, domestic politicians most, for spreading that misinformation, but they're also deeply concerned about some of those social networks like Facebook and WhatsApp in South Africa and Kenya. And then finally, I think a key part of the future is going to be how we build time, how we build relationships, how we build habit back into news in a digital format. And I talked about a few examples and ways in which media companies are doing that, and it would be good to reflect on some of that in the discussion. So sorry about losing you halfway through there, but I hope that was useful and clear and just gives you some of the main points, including some of the data points about South Africa, and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks very much. Just a reminder to everybody, you can type your questions into the chat and just address them to the person you want to answer the question. If it's general, just type question in the subject line so we can pick them out of the general chat. So I'm going to start the panel now, but also, so I'm going to do a couple of things on the panel. Obviously, the first thing is we want to get Mahlatse and Purity to they've taken a look at the global overall survey, wanted to try and kind of draw some conclusions which might help address some questions in Kenya and South Africa from the kind of broader survey results, and also maybe to unpack a bit more the differences between the results that we have in Kenya and South Africa versus the global averages. I mean, for me, the most startling one, and we'll get to that later, is the one around Kenyans and South Africans being right up in the top 2 or 3 countries in the world who are looking for more information around climate change, which I find very interesting, which is either because we are more literate or because we are closer to death than the rest of the world. We can discuss that later. So I'm going to kick it off with a question to Mahlatse and Purity, but obviously they feel free to preface your discussion of this question with some questions to Nick if you want to clarify anything. So I guess the big issue and the most interesting issue is the question of trust in the news, because that is essentially one of the currencies which is going to allow us to survive and flourish as news industries in our respective countries. So trust in the news, South Africa and Kenya are high up at 50 and 48, above the average. Can we maybe talk a little bit about why that is and the general kind of impression you have of trust in the news in your countries? So we can start with Mahlatse.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Nick, for that detailed presentation and quite engaging. When we look at trust in South Africa, we know that it has been on the decline, though. While comparing us to the rest of the world, we are faring quite well. We are quite concerned, especially as the South African National Editors Forum, because that trust relationship is declining. I mean, just to give you an example, there was a time when, for example, the public broadcaster of South Africa, when I used to work there, was the second most trusted institution after churches. And that is a great place to be for a public broadcaster. But over the years, when we look at the trust barometer that is done, there has been a decline overall. And from a public broadcaster point of view, there will have been issues of interference within that, therefore questioning the credibility. But in terms of news in general, we went through a phase where Bill Pottinger, which will be quite familiar to a lot of people, had driven quite an aggressive campaign against the media, where they started, because they were exposing the former president Jacob Zuma and those linked to him, exposing the corruption that they were linked to. Then there was this massive deep pockets funded campaign to discredit the media in South Africa. And we think that actually did play a role, because we're still suffering from the remnants of that. So words like white monopoly capital used to describe the media continue till today. And then also we continuously seeing politicians using apartheid language like Stratcom to label journalists when they do investigative reporting. And that is part and parcel of just trying to discredit the media as part of remnants of apartheid, a hated regime, obviously, but also white-owned and not reflective of South Africa's transformation processes. Though encouraging that compared to the rest of the world, we are faring much better, we acknowledge that there is still a lot of work to do. And just to also add, Nic, I know that you didn't look in particular at South Africa in terms of once the virus hit. We also saw quite an increase in the number of people that were turning to traditional news websites because people were looking for credible information. So journalism became quite important, and people were turning to traditional news media, where we're seeing increases of about 72% for some of the online publications. So quite massive in that regard. But sadly though, at the time when journalism really matters and the public is looking for journalism and good journalism to make sense of this pandemic, the industry is not coping. We did a quick survey, and I'll just give you just the quick findings of the impact of COVID on South African media. And basically we found that advertising revenue almost disappeared for a lot of media companies. And obviously the print industry was the biggest casualty. A lot of the print organizations and also broadcasts had to introduce salary cuts if they were continuing to publish. But also, we also saw that magazines that had been around for almost 100 years closed shop. And we had almost 300 people losing their jobs. And also affected were the small local publications where they just did not have any way to survive. And we've seen job losses there, about 400 in that sector. So COVID, bringing back the relationship that we are looking for in terms of the public trusting the media and turning to the media for information, but the sustainability or the economic future of the industry in question.
Thanks. I'm gonna want to return to this a bit later when we talk about the issue of fake news and misinformation and so on, because obviously there's a nexus there in terms of the more that peddlers of misinformation are driving the erosion of trust in news, the more that affects the business case of news as well. But let me first, before we get to that, bring in Purity. Purity, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me, Chris?
We can. So I did introduce you earlier, Purity, who is from Africa Uncensored. So Purity, could you give us your take on the situation in Kenya in terms of trust in the news as it relates to the digital news report?
Well, it was interesting to go through the global report and see the very interesting spikes in the Kenyan and South African front. The most interesting bit for me is trust didn't seem to guarantee viewership when you compare that the traditional news outlets, TV, newspapers, seem to have almost 100% trust, between 90 and 89%. But when you go to people who rely on those sources for news on a weekly basis, it comes down all the way to 70%. And even the most trusted outlet, which is KTN News, happens to have about just 54% of the respondents saying that they rely on them weekly. So for me, the interesting bit is, as much as we have very high trust level, given those are the traditional sources of information, or what people are normally used to, it doesn't seem to guarantee the same level of viewership, meaning that the traditional news outlets lose a bit of it to social media and to WhatsApp, because of also the age gap that is represented in the data set. However, I was interested to see if this research had happened for Kenya in the last 2 years, that is in 2017, I think the trust level would have been much lower. So for example, I feel like next year, when the same research happened the year before or the year during elections, in real sense, the trust is much lower because there's a lot of political gimmicks going on and a lot of political misinformation. And in the last election, we had quite a bit of backlash from audience until the media got a nickname. The Kenyans would know the Kikiveri media term, because they were feeling that media was just relying on what the politicians are saying, and they're not giving us too much value. And at that time, I think the trust must have gone lower than the 90%. So I feel the trust fluctuates based on specific events like elections, and now like the pandemic, because all people could rely on for getting pandemic information is the news outlet. So people would go there to get the exact information from the government organization. But what happens after the pandemic? Are they able to maintain the same kind of trust? What happens as we near the election? And what would be the challenge of the fluctuating trust in the sustainability of the media industry? So in terms of trust, that is what was coming out strongly to me as I read the report.
Yeah, and in fact, the interesting, just to jump ahead a little bit, so Kenya and South Africa are neck and neck in a lot of categories. I'm making it sound like a horse race. It's not. I mean, it's not a competition, but it just is quite interesting how the same levels of trust, for example, and there are a couple of parallels with Kenya and South Africa throughout the report, but where they do differ quite, I wouldn't say alarmingly, but where they do differ quite a lot is when the question is asked, what should the media do with statements from politicians that could be false? Where South Africans would prefer that the news report the statement because it's important for the public to know what the politicians said. Also because I think our politicians are kind of fun as well. But in Kenya, and then in South Africa, there's a very low percentage who say that we shouldn't emphasize a statement. And in Kenya, it's reversed. Would any of you like to speak to why that might be the point, why that might be the case?
I think there's a famous quote by a former premier in Mpumalanga here in South Africa who said, it's okay for politicians to lie. And that generated a lot of conversations in the country. I think generally South Africans expect us to reflect the politicians to them, and they don't want the media to kind of be seen as either diluting what the politicians are saying. They would rather just hear it for themselves and then encourage debates. The one thing that is quite great around the country is that we have quite a strong debate in country. So listen to any talk radio stations or go to Twitter or to social media. Debate then happens where people can either be in support or against that politician, and then that drives the conversation around criticizing the politician himself. And I think there's a fear around, if media starts deciding what should be told and what shouldn't, then their right to know is then limited in a way. So it's quite understandable that people feel that they can make up their own minds. They want to hear and have the politicians say in their own words what they believe in.
And Purity, would you say that in Kenya that's slightly different? I mean, I'm asking kind of an anecdotal analysis here rather than,
Yeah.
you know, figures, but.
Yeah, in Kenya, what is quite common are political discussions where journalists try to have like balanced kind of panels, and then they will let the politicians go at each other. Like hear one side of the politicians and then get the other side of the front, and then they talk at each other with the journalist not trying to interfere too much on what should be the fact or what should not be the fact. But what you find on the other side of the audience is they sort of rate the journalist on the kind of value they are able to extract from those discussions. So what is common here is having sort of fighting panels, like bring one side of the politician and the other side of the politicians and let them fight, and the audience are there watching. In fact, people say the media is just providing political drama, and us we are here just watching. So sometimes the audience feel like a journalist should have a bit of value, but I think also media houses don't want to be at the risk of seeming like they are supporting one side or the other. So they try to maintain the balance, but the line is too slim.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I could bring Nic in now, because this speaks to one of the questions. And I'm going to ask you why the Reuters Institute framed the question the way you did. But one of the questions about whether people prefer the media to be ostensibly objective, or media that is kind of more partisan. And I mean, maybe there's some lessons that we can take from those survey results globally and apply to our own local markets.
Yeah, it was. This is a question we asked in 2013, and as you know, there's a huge debate now about whether the media can be impartial, or can be neutral, or should be neutral, or should essentially just be more open and transparent about its biases and talk more directly to audiences and give them more of what they want. So in the US, you have the sort of foxification of news, if you like, where television in particular plays to one side of the aisle or the other. Whereas the sort of tradition of public broadcasting, for example, is that you try and reflect all positions and talk to a mass audience. So we were interested to see if that had changed, and it was a question we asked in 2013. It actually came originally from a Pew question, and it's a slightly binary choice, and these concepts are quite slippery. But I think the essential point, and most people in the survey said that they wanted news to be neutral in some way, and I think what they meant by that is they didn't want these hidden agendas. They wanted news to be just give me the facts and let me make up my own opinion. I think we just heard that sort of view from South Africa. A lot of people talking about that. We did in some countries, like at the US, we saw an increase in the percentage of people who said that they preferred news that reinforced, that shared their perspectives. And that's perhaps what you would expect, because we have seen a rise of polarization and partisanship in the US. But in general, it feels there is still a silent majority that wants news to lay out the facts and let people understand them without these sort of agendas or hidden agendas. And I'm kind of interested to know whether in South Africa, the media in the UK or in the US, the media definitely has an agenda, and that often permeates through into the news coverage. But the trust scores that I saw suggest that that's not the case quite as much in Kenya and South Africa.
Well, I think the chairperson of SANEF is peculiarly poised to answer this question. And then we'll go to Purity.
It's been quite an interesting debate in South Africa where, for example, in Western countries, you would have much clear separation of news media houses where they're either seen as left and others are seen as right. We don't have that differentiation in South Africa. And when we've had publications, for example, attempted, they've been thrown back with a lot of bricks, if I may say so. I mean, I just remember the Mail and Guardian, Chris, if you remember, basically encouraging people not to vote for the ANC. Whereas this could be a conversation that is normal in a lot of Western countries, the newspaper itself faced a lot of criticism where people were not expecting it to take quite an open position on politics. So a lot of the time we find that the media in South Africa tends to be more in the middle and to cover both sides equally, and shy away from taking quite a particular stand. And what they will do is that whether it's in their editorial opinion pages, they will try and find a more balanced view as opposed to taking one particular angle. But also in South Africa, look, we have a very dominant governing party. The ANC has been around since the dawn of democracy and continues to be voted quite highly. So, and opposition parties are really small and have not really shown to have the muscle to unseat the ANC. So a lot of media from a governing party point of view will be seen as opposition media, because a lot of focus will be on the governing party, as it's the only one we've known since the dawn of democracy.
Yeah, and in fact, it's interesting that a guy called Kyle Finley has done a social media sentiment analysis of the media, South African media on Twitter, and unlike in the USA, the majority of media, social media accounts and journalists are concentrated in the middle, in the moderate mainstream area, whereas obviously in America it's wildly polarized. Purity, I think there's actually a question here about social media from Swati Kaushik, and I'll get to that right after we've heard from Purity. Purity, do you want to comment on the question? I think you're on mute. Purity, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry, I'm saying I can't be able to read the question from. I'm saying, yeah. Can you hear me now, Chris?
So you're breaking up.
Yeah, I'm saying I couldn't see the question on the.
Well, I'll tell you, let me read out the question.
Sorry, I had to be joining on the phone.
Yeah, let me read out this question there from Swati, which is, how come social media is so trusted in some of the markets when it has no authority, basically, to monitor the quality of news, has no authenticity? So why is it a preferred news platform? I have an answer for that, but let's give somebody else a stab as well.
I think to jump into that is it's more convenient, especially for the younger generation who don't have the time to sit with their parents, especially in the African setup, to be watching the traditional TV or radio. It's more convenient, and most of the people between 18, 34, and 40, they are always on the move, and now they have their smartphones. So I personally think the smartphones and their accessibility to internet makes it easier for people to want to get quick updates, especially quick updates on Twitter or on Facebook or on WhatsApp. Most young people say, well, like when they wake up, the first thing they do is go through their social media pages to check the summary of the things that are happening. And so they don't feel like they need to be following the in-depth stuff on traditional TV. Yeah, and in terms of the objectivity, the question that was discussed right before, I think it was interesting to see that in Kenya, both traditional and online news come from the same outlets. So I feel like in Kenya, we don't have enough quite active news outlets that are not distinct from the traditional TV stations and radio stations, because you will see from the data, both online and both offline, the known brands are the ones that are leading. So I think also in terms of news being online and being able to counter the amount of misinformation coming from the online setup, there is less of investment, and this is when most of the independent online outlets are coming up and doing much more investment in that front. But yeah, it was quite interesting to see that the traditional brands are in control of both offline and online spaces.
Can I just add a little bit?
Answered the question.
Sorry, can I just add a little bit on the social media thing? I mean, I think what we find is people are using social media very heavily, but they say they don't trust it. And what's that about? Well, I think in many countries, it's that people aren't really going to social media for news. I think they probably do that a bit more in South Africa and Kenya. But even so, you're basically going there to check what your friends are up to and what's happening today and all those things. And news is a bit incidental. So it is the point that Purity makes about convenience trumping, the fear of misinformation, if you like. So both can be true. And I think the point Purity makes about the digital born brands is really interesting. I think there's a huge gap in Kenya, it looks to me, for independent digital born media if it gets the formula right, because it is now possible to distribute digitally stuff that is different. And it looks like you're getting a lot of the same stuff from the same brands. And so at some stage, there's probably going to be an opportunity, as there was in South Africa for News 24, for N24.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's basically it. When you're trusting social media, you're trusting your friends who've earned your trust, essentially. But that does lead us rather conveniently onto the next topic, which is around fake news and misinformation online. So I think the global average was 56% of the people surveyed were concerned about what is real and fake on the internet. Whereas in South Africa and Kenya, it was Kenya 76% and South Africa 72%. So essentially in the top 5 countries who worry about what is real and what is fake. Let me begin perhaps with Purity and ask you, what is that about? Why do we have in South Africa and Kenya, and you can speak to Kenya of course, why do we have this high degree of suspicion around our ability to be able to tell what's real and what's fake?
Two things. One of the most used platforms in Kenya is WhatsApp. And WhatsApp is mainly the same thing Nic has said about trusting your friends and trusting the people you know. So people will quickly share stuff they see on WhatsApp because it was shared by someone they know or someone they thought is trusted or is reliable. And then the information will keep on moving rounds across WhatsApp groups. So the WhatsApp groups, according to me, they're the biggest challenge for misinformation in Kenya. The next thing is there is a lot of commercialization of social media. You will know Kenya, when anything is running in East Africa, there will be a lot of traffic coming from Kenya on Twitter especially, and it's because there are people who run that as a business. We refer to them as keyboard warriors. Like if someone has an agenda to push, they can actually pay people who run the business of getting that agenda trending on Twitter. So in Kenya, there's a lot of commercialization, especially on the Twitter side, and also because of the very high use of WhatsApp, makes the news spread, the misinformation or the fake news spread faster. By the time someone verifies it, and the facts won't spread as fast as the fake ones because they're less sensational. The information has gone too far. So I think that's why there's very high concern on the amount of misinformation that people experience here in Kenya.
That's quite an interesting proposition that WhatsApp's teaching us to be suspicious of the world.
Because you're suspicious of your own family group.
That goes before technology. Mahlatse, would you like to maybe address?
Yeah, I think, and I agree with a lot of what Purity is saying, but also just to add, also in South Africa, we have seen these attempts to duplicate traditional online platforms where there'll be a fake lookalike of a News 24 or an EWN. That has been quite big in South Africa, and I think a lot of us have spent a lot of time trying to bring those websites down because they literally just mirror your own website in terms of colors, in terms of signage, etc. But of course, it's maybe got a 2 somewhere in the middle of EWN. But a lot of our audiences, what we find is that they don't necessarily look where the story is coming from. If they just see familiar branding, they will assume that that is a story by a media house that they actually do trust. So we've had to do a lot of, and that it's an education campaign we need to intensify, where we are telling the public, you know, just don't believe everything you read, but also double check the sources of that information. Just because it's on social media, it doesn't mean that it is by a credible news organization. I mean, we've seen those cloned, like the SABC, News 24, across the board. We've all had to deal with these chances that just duplicate these websites as they try to make money. So I think we need to have a serious education campaign to tell the public to be quite discerning, and also to just be aware and double check where the information is coming from. You'll be surprised. I mean, we've had fake news around somebody as important as Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a web page created saying that he has passed away, and that will quickly spread. And I think it spreads because people are just not verifying the information. And then we have to come back and say, no, but then that is not true. And then somebody says, but it looks exactly like your website. What do you mean that it's actually not true? And I also just think it's also, I think, you know, it might also just do with literacy levels as well within the population. People that have access to online tend to be people that have money, and then as more and more poorer people have access, and sometimes people that don't necessarily have the high levels of education that we're looking for, that could just be affected in terms of being unable to differentiate what is true and what isn't. And I think, you know, generally the public would like to open a web page and believe what they're reading is true. And if those stories are written very much like the way their own trusted source of news information would write the stories, it just creates confusion. And people that are new to online access or to reading news online would then just be confused. And therefore, I think that mistrust would seep in.
There's actually an interesting question from Herman Wasserman, which Mahlatse has answered on chat, but which might benefit from some from surfacing it, which is probably one that Nic could cover as well, which is, do you think trust figures would look different if the question would be asked to people who are not online? So I think it's kind of, that question kind of means, you know, would trust in news be as high if we're looking at the non-online media properties in Kenya and in South Africa, or indeed anywhere in the world?
Yeah, I mean, obviously in some countries there is not much difference. Like pretty much everyone is online in some of those Northern European countries that I was talking about before. But I think, you know, what has online done? And we've sort of heard about this already. It's kind of confused people. It's created sort of fragmentation. It's meant that when they're in social media, you get, you know, very confusing signals, whereas news used to be much clearer about what journalism was, what quality journalism was that had been through some kind of process, as distinct from information that is just available on the internet. And I think it's done that, and then I think you've had on top of that this layer of politicians fueling the fire, if you like, for their own purposes. You know, talking about fake news media, trying to tar the media in with the same brush. And I think those combination of things have been part of what's led to this declining trust that we talked about earlier in almost every country that we've looked at over time. Not all, but most countries. So yeah, there is something about online. I think we have a problem. You know, we have a problem. I think online has given us more skepticism. We've been able to see more sources of news. We've had, you know, we've in many ways had more control, and that's good. But when skepticism turns over into disdain or toxic discussion, that's dangerous. And I think that's where we've got to in some cases.
Yeah, or when it becomes weaponized by bad
Or
actors.
becomes weaponized by politicians, which we are seeing in so many countries. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, that would be an interesting question for Purity and Mahlatse. You look at the most trusted brands results in your respective countries. Do you see any, do those match how you would have expected those results to turn out? Do you see any kind of anomalies there?
For me, I think there's something around, for example, an online publication leading that. I think obviously News 24 is the biggest online publication in Africa, and it makes sense. They are ranking of #1. I think it's also important that the SABC, given how massive it is, that they would be ranked there. And I mean, there are a few others without getting into media wars, and that I wondered if that was actually in reality, given where those publications have found themselves in the past few years and how they've actually found themselves being criticized and actually getting a lot of very important stories wrong. And conversations around their credibility having dominated the news agenda. But I think there is also a conversation just around, you know, probably if the people that we are reaching are representative of a South African public.
Yeah, I mean, I can be less sensitive because I don't actually belong to a media house. But the idea that independent online, which is basically a captured media house with a corrupt owner, is ahead of the Daily Maverick, which has broken all these amazing investigative stories, is an interesting anomaly. I'm not saying it's wrong.
Can I just add a bit of perspective on that, Chris? So I think what we see is,
I'm trying to make fun of the Daily Maverick, so it better be funny.
Is the sorry, no, go on, be funny about the Daily.
No, go.
I was going to say that what we see this all the time is that a lot of amazing digital-born brands that are doing fantastic investigative journalism don't get the recognition. It's partly because they're not speaking to huge audiences. It's partly because they haven't got that track record over time. I mean, trust basically comes from track record over time. So maybe with the Independent or whatever, people are remembering what the Independent was as much as what it is, etc. in South Africa. So it can move slowly, but it can also collapse quickly. You've also seen cases of brands getting things wrong, and that brand trust really collapses very quickly as well. So it's a fragile thing. You know, I think some, you know, just seeing them in this table is often slightly unfair as well. Definitely unfair on some digital-born brands that are doing amazing work, and probably over generous to some complacent brands that are sitting there looking at their trust scores and talking about them.
Yeah, and Purity, if you were going to do a quick snapshot analysis of the brand trust scores for the Kenyan media, what would your analysis be there? Does it fit the way you think perceptions?
Yeah. Sorry, I think it was interesting to find the Kenyans.co.ke among the top of the most used, the most relied on source of news among all these big brands which are traditional. And it was sort of not disappointing, surprising not to find like Uncensored or The Elephant, which does which I thought had a lot of in-depth reporting. Yeah, it was quite a bit disturbing, because I was like, although I know Kenyans.co.ke are very, very intentional in doing their online work, I know a bit of their structure, their investment for online work is quite intentional and quite huge. But I was expecting, because they do more of daily news outlets, but I was expecting a bit more of in-depth outlets, like maybe The Elephant and Africa Uncensored. It's also in terms of misinformation, since a lot of misinformation comes out and spread fast, I'm also concerned like how much fact-checking and verification would have to play in the future, because we just started a platform on fact-checking, and I can promise you every day there is at least one, if not two, not more, kind of things to be re-verified and rewritten about. But the traffic is not as much as you see with the misinformation. So I am thinking probably, it's interesting to have Kenya's.co.ke among the main brands on both fronts. So it raises a question that the rest of us could have to be investing more and being more intentional in connecting with the audience and really understanding how to tap on the WhatsApp and on the Facebook kind of audience, and how you can use that platform to disseminate information.
Can I just comment briefly on that point? I think that there's many ways in which media can be successful, and quite often what we see in these sort of league tables, it's kind of a popularity contest. It's who's biggest. It's about, the media's been about reaching mass audiences. But I think increasingly there's going to be many ways to be successful and influential in society. About reaching small influential audiences and changing policy is just as important, or is a really important part of the picture, as well as reaching mass audiences. And I just think we're going to see much more of that. The era of mass media is not over, but we're definitely going to see more mass media and more niche media, and more media that really is trying to deliver value to particular sets of people.
And I mean, maybe that's a good segue into what was going to be my last question. Just before I do that, there's a question from Marinette Jordan on media outlets doing enough to increase trust, which is answered very usefully in the chat. So I urge everybody to go have a look at Mahlatse's answer there. So my last question, and I think Nic, maybe you could introduce this for us, is what lessons have we learned from the survey that could persuade more people to pay for news? So you covered it earlier, but maybe just a quick intro, then Mahlatse and Purity, maybe you can give us country-specific answers.
Yeah, so, and I'm really interested to hear about some of those country-specific, because I'm aware that, the world is moving at very different paces on this, but we are witnessing this enormous shock with coronavirus. Even before coronavirus, media companies were really struggling to make money out of digital. So as they were moving from print to digital, the print advertising and print revenues were falling, and digital wasn't making up the gains. Much of that was going to the big platforms, much of the advertising, because they could target them better. And now we have coronavirus on top with, as we've heard in South Africa, advertising disappearing or falling 50% or whatever. So this is a real crisis point. And I think many organizations are thinking very seriously and changing their strategy as a result quite quickly, to think about how do they diversify revenue streams, how do they cut costs, how do they do a combination of those things, and what does that mean for the independence and plurality of our media? I think this is going to be a real sort of turning point. We may not realize that today, but in 3 months, 6 months, a year's time, I think we will. And I think the big question is, what are the models that are being pursued? What will be right in an African context? You don't want to take the Norway model and impose subscription on everything and shut people out from news. It's incredibly important to everyone. That's not going to happen in Africa. But what are the alternatives, and how do you think that's going to develop?
I think one of the striking issues is the fact that the audience is more interested in video content, which is quite difficult to monetize. So at Uncensored, we do both video and written, and yes, there is more viewership on the video content, but monetizing it on YouTube is not even like a drop in the ocean. So that was quite an interesting point that media owners would have to struggle with, because if it's subscription, it's easier to have subscriptions for the written and text content, but for video, it's going to be quite difficult. But currently, what we rely on mainly is funded projects, commissioned projects, and then for public interest, making sure whatever we get from whatever revenue we generate, we can then use it for the public interest content that necessarily don't have to be paid for. But the monetizing is quite a big issue, given that the advertising isn't coming quite through. And even with the pandemic, spending is going to be less from all corners. Most of the media houses have been affected by the pandemic, and salary cuts, retrenchment, and all that has already taken place. But we hope as we get out of the pandemic, people will have to be more innovative on how they can monetize the content. But it was interesting to see that the audience wants the video content more than the written content, yet it's the handout content to monetize. So yeah, even as we speak about subscriptions, I wonder how we can.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, the results of that bit of the survey, that 93% of the people surveyed in Kenya accessed online news video in the last week, and it's 81% in South Africa. Given the limitations of that sample, as Nic was talking about earlier, that's still quite an extraordinary number, I would have thought.
Yeah, but this is, I mean, many publications in Europe and America have really struggled with this as well, because in social media, it's a very popular format, but they can't make any money out of it. So they kind of moved away from that, and they've tried to develop different formats that they can monetize more easily. So audio is one of those. They're going into longer form video, so television, because you can monetize it because you're spending more time with it. I think short form video in social media is not going to be a great place to monetize. I think it's going to remain extremely difficult. So people may love it, but it's going to be really hard because you're putting a lot of effort into something that you're not going to make out of, and you're not developing loyalty.
Yeah, Mahlatse?
Yeah, I mean, I'm encouraged to hear that, you know, there's probably some appetite to monetize news, but I'm very skeptical as a South African audience, as a South African, that we will actually succeed, because we still don't have the public linking good journalism to having to pay for it. People still assume if I am paying for data, and once I'm on the website, I'm on the internet, I should be able to access things for free because I'm already paying for data. So I really think we have quite a long way to go in convincing the public to pay for online news, especially because, you know, we still have large parts of the population accessing news via the radio, or via the radio as number one, and then also television. In one of the webinars that we had, I mean, we had the SABC's Chief Executive of News, Patiswa, talking about how they were also impacted. I mean, programming was basically displaced as they've had to carry the many press conferences of government, and therefore they've lost advertising revenue as a result. And surely you can't expect the public broadcaster that depends over 70% of their revenue coming from advertisers to put a subscription in front, or a paywall in front of their news. That would definitely be against what the public mandate is. So that would not be an option for the public broadcaster. I think also for the rest of us, I'm still not convinced that those that have put a paywall have had the success that they've been looking for. I think a lot of it was still supported by the print versions of, they were still printing the newspapers, and that's where the money was coming from. Whether it will be economical, I'm still yet to see it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm quite amused that SANEF's official position is that we're all doomed, but I did a bit of research into the paywall stuff, and there's a success story marginally is the Daily Maverick, I think, and Netwerk 24, and those are obviously for kind of niched reasons. I think what it needs is a big player like News 24, Times Live, to implement a paywall that works, not a fake one like Times Live has got. Guys, thanks very much. There's still quite a few interesting questions, which Mahlatse and Purity and Nic, you might want to go and answer in the chat. But let me ask you guys for a final thought, and then we can wrap it up. So we can start with Nic, I think.
Final thought. It's been fascinating. I mean, I've really learned a lot about some of the differences between media consumption, some of the underlying causes about trust, some of which are positive, but I think some of which are also quite difficult as well. And I think for me, the interesting question is that one we finished with is how are South African and Kenyan media going to make money going forwards without becoming more dependent on government advertising, big businesses who want to get their agendas across. I think this is going to be really difficult because, as we've heard, it's going to be really difficult to do paywalls. And but I think that is where the effort needs to go. What mix of funding models could provide niche media and mass media, and there'll probably be different models. How can we create a media infrastructure that has the right mix and plurality and quality at the same time in what is going to be a very different economic situation, I think.
Purity?
I think to close, I would really like to acknowledge the team that worked on the paper. It's a very in-depth paper. And as a closing remark, I think we still have an opportunity to create more distinctive and quality content, even as we think of how to monetize it. I think we still have to be working harder every day to have more quality news that the audience can be obliged to pay for. In spite of the fact that the report shows now that most of the audience wouldn't do anything to pay for news, I think we still have an opportunity to create more quality content in this side of the world. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Purity. Mahlatse?
When the lockdown started, I wrote a column just as a letter to the industry, because I really believe that COVID-19 gave us an opportunity as a media industry to rebuild the trust relationship. And I still think that this is the great opportunity. Yes, we are beginning to see signs of a nation that is fatigued, but I think given the fact that in South Africa, we're still heading towards a peak in provinces like Gauteng, we're still going to see the huge numbers of people turning to traditional media for news. And it's important for us as an industry to meet that hunger for news with credible information for the public. And that's the one way we can rebuild that trust relationship. And hopefully, when this survey is done again, those numbers will continue to increase. We need to rebuild this relationship. It is quite critical, not only for our survival, but to just ensure that our democracies continue to grow and are strengthened.
Yeah, and I think, just my closing remark would be that it's a shame that this data is only for Kenya and South Africa. There's nothing to do with the Reuters Institute, it's to do with us. The fact that our media houses operate basically in data darkness at the moment is deplorable, to quote Hillary Clinton. I really think that the media industries in our respective African countries need to do a hell of a lot more to invest in trying to get some of this data, to get some of this information together, and to get it together in a Pan-African sense as well, so we can learn from each other's initiatives and mistakes, rather than having to learn from the data set that comes from Europe and North America and South America. So that would be my closing remark, which is that I hope that we can emulate this going forward, and anybody who has an interest in this can please tweet me or email me, and we can get a discussion going on this. So thank you, Mahlatse, Purity, and Nic. It's been really good, and thanks to the Reuters team behind the scenes there. I'm sure beavering away industriously. And the guys who joined in the audience, thank you so much, and thanks for the great questions. We'll try and answer some of them in the chat right now. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Goodbye.